As the evening wound down and the study group packed up their books, Officer Chen stood to leave. Looking back at the scene, Destiny and her mother in their warm, safe home, surrounded by evidence of their new life, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was a new beginning, not just for one family, but for an entire community that had learned the true meaning of taking care of its own. The story of the girl in the playground hadn't ended that cold night 3 months ago. Instead, it had grown into something bigger, something that continued to touch lives and create change. And somewhere out there, Officer Chen knew another child might be struggling in silence. But now, thanks to Destiny's courage in sharing her story, that child would find help sooner, would know that they didn't have to face their challenges alone. 3 months had passed since that cold night in the playground, and the changes in Destiny and her mother's lives were remarkable. Standing in front of their new apartment building, Officer Chen could hardly believe the transformation. The modest 2-bedroom unit wasn't fancy, but with donated furniture and personal touches, it had become a real home. Inside, the sound of laughter filled the small living room, where Destiny sat surrounded by textbooks and notepads. She was no longer studying alone under park lights. Instead, she had turned their dining table into a tutoring station where she helped other students with their math homework. "You should have seen her presentation today," her mother said proudly, serving hot chocolate to the small study group. She had just returned from her catering management job, still wearing her professional clothes that spoke of her own transformation. She told our story to the whole school assembly. Destiny looked up from her tutoring, her eyes bright with purpose. "I was nervous at first," she admitted, "but I remembered what Officer Chen said about helping others by sharing our experience." She turned to one of her students, pointing at a math problem. "See? Sometimes the hardest problems have solutions we just can't see on our own." Officer Chen smiled, remembering the assembly. Destiny had stood tall on that stage, her voice clear and strong as she described her nights in the playground. But instead of focusing on the hardship, she had talked about hope, community, and the power of asking for help. "After my story was published in the local newspaper," Destiny continued, gathering her thoughts, "so many people came forward. Not just to help us, but to share their own stories. We weren't alone. There were other families struggling in silence too." She was right. Her story had sparked something in their community. The police department had started a new outreach program, identifying and helping homeless students before they ended up sleeping in parks. Local businesses had created a job training and placement program for struggling parents. The school had established an emergency fund for families facing housing insecurity. "Remember that first night in the transition center?" Destiny's mother asked, sitting down next to Officer Chen. "I was so scared, so ashamed. I thought people would judge us." She looked around their apartment at the walls covered with Destiny's awards and family photos. "Instead, they lifted us up." Officer Chen nodded, thinking about how this one family's story had changed his own approach to policing. He no longer saw just problems to solve. He saw people with stories, with strength, with potential just waiting for a chance to shine. "The best part," Destiny said, closing her textbook for a moment, "is that now I can help others. Last week, we helped another family move into their new apartment. Mom made them dinner, and I showed their kids how to organize their study schedule." Her face lit up with pride. "We're not just receiving help anymore, we're giving it too." The changes went beyond just their family. The playground where Officer Chen had found Destiny was being transformed into a community gathering space. Local artists had painted murals telling stories of hope and resilience. The park lights that once illuminated Destiny's desperate studying now shone on community events and family gatherings. "You know what I realized?" Destiny's mother said softly, watching her daughter return to helping her students. "We talk about making it through hard times, about surviving. But this isn't just about surviving anymore. This is about thriving, about building something better not just for ourselves, but for others too." Officer Chen understood exactly what she meant. In his 20 years on the force, he'd seen many cases that ended with simple solutions, a problem fixed, a situation handled. But this was different. This had created ripples of change throughout the entire community. "Next week," Destiny announced, gathering her papers, "I'm speaking at the city council meeting. They want to hear my ideas about helping other kids who might be struggling." She looked at Officer Chen. Will you come? You're the one who taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others help. I wouldn't miss it, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. But remember, you're the brave one. You turned your struggle into strength, your pain into purpose. You showed us all what community really means. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed not just Destiny and her mother's lives, but touched the entire community. Officer Chen's first stop after leaving the transition center had been his police precinct, where he shared Destiny's story during the morning briefing. The reaction was immediate and heartfelt. I found this girl, not much older than my own daughter, sleeping in our playground, he told his fellow officers, his voice thick with emotion. She was going to school every day, doing her homework under the park lights, all while trying to protect her mother from worrying. We can't let this family struggle alone. By the end of that day, the precinct had started a donation drive. Officers brought in everything from warm clothes to school supplies. The police chief himself wrote a check to help with the family's first month's rent once they found an apartment. But what touched Officer Chen most was how his colleagues wanted to know more about Destiny herself, not just to help, but to understand. She got an A+ on her math test while sleeping in a playground, he told them, showing the crumpled test paper Destiny had let him keep. Imagine what she could achieve with actual support. The school principal's response was equally swift when Officer Chen visited later that day. She immediately called a meeting with Destiny's teachers, who were shocked to learn what their bright, hard-working student had been going through. She never missed a single assignment, her English teacher said, wiping away tears. She even volunteered to tutor younger students during lunch break. The teacher paused, remembering something. I'd always thought it was strange that she never ate during those sessions. Now I understand why. The school community rallied quickly. Teachers quietly arranged for extra food to be available for Destiny during those tutoring sessions. The school counselor set up regular check-ins, not just for academic support, but to make sure Destiny knew she had someone to talk to. The Parent-Teacher Association started a special fund to help families in similar situations. But perhaps the most surprising response came from the local business community. When Officer Chen reached out to the Chamber of Commerce, he expected polite interest at best. Instead, he found himself invited to speak at their next meeting. This isn't just about one family, he told the gathered business owners. It's about who we are as a community. This young girl believed in education so much that she did her homework by park light rather than give up on school. Her mother was working 2 jobs before they lost their home. These are the kind of people we should be investing in. The response was overwhelming. One restaurant owner immediately offered Destiny's mother a job managing their catering division, complete with health benefits and flexible hours. A local real estate agent promised to help find them an affordable apartment. Other business owners pitched in with furniture, household items, and even a small scholarship fund for Destiny's future education. Back at the transition center, Destiny and her mother were almost overwhelmed by the community's response. I don't understand, Destiny's mother said, tears in her eyes as she looked at the job offer letter. Why are all these people helping us? Officer Chen, who had stopped by to share the good news, smiled gently. Because your story reminded everyone what community really means. Your daughter's strength, your determination to keep going no matter what, it touched people's hearts. But more than that, it made them want to be better, to do better. Destiny, sitting cross-legged on her bed, looked up from the new backpack filled with school supplies that one of the officers had brought. Mom, she said softly, remember how you always said education was our way forward? Maybe this is part of our education too, learning that it's okay to let people help sometimes. Her mother crossed the room to hug her, and Officer Chen noticed how both of them seemed to stand a little straighter now, as if the weight of their secret was finally lifting. The room itself felt different too, no longer just a temporary shelter, but a stepping stone to something better. Tomorrow, Destiny's mother said, holding the job offer letter like it was made of gold, I start my new job. And you, my brave girl, you can focus on just being a student again. No more worrying about where to sleep or what to eat. Officer Chen watched them embrace, feeling his own eyes grow misty. In just a few days, he had watched a community transform from strangers passing in the night to people reaching out to help their neighbors. But more than that, he He had watched hope return to a family that had nearly lost it. The Family Transition Center stood quiet and solid in the pre-dawn hours, its brick walls offering a promise of safety that Destiny hadn't felt in weeks. Officer Chen watched as mother and daughter reunited in the center's warm lobby, their tears and tight embrace saying more than words ever could. "My baby," Destiny's mother whispered, holding her daughter close, her own face wet with tears. "My strong, brave, beautiful baby." She pulled back slightly, cupping Destiny's face in her hands, studying her as if memorizing every detail. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have figured something out together." Destiny leaned into her mother's touch, her careful facade finally crumbling completely. "I didn't want you to worry more than you already were," she said through her tears. "You were trying so hard to find a job, and I thought I could handle it until things got better." Ms. Rivera, the housing coordinator, stood quietly nearby, giving them space for their reunion while preparing the paperwork for their temporary housing. Officer Chen noticed how she discreetly wiped her own eyes, touched by the scene before her. "We have a room ready for you both," Ms. Rivera said gently, once the initial wave of emotion had passed. "It's not very big, but it's clean and warm, and most importantly, you'll be together." She gestured toward the hallway. "Would you like to see it?" As they walked down the corridor, Officer Chen couldn't help but notice how Destiny and her mother held hands tightly, as if afraid they might be separated again. The room, when they reached it, was indeed small but welcoming. 2 neat beds with fresh linens stood against one wall, a small desk beneath the window, and a compact dresser for their belongings. "This will be your home base while we work on finding something permanent," Ms. Rivera explained. "We have programs here to help with job searching, and we can connect you with other services you might need." Destiny's mother nodded gratefully, but Officer Chen could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. "I've been applying everywhere," she said softly, "but without a permanent address." "That's where we come in," Ms. Rivera smiled warmly. "You can use this address for job applications now." And speaking of jobs, she pulled out a folder from her bag. "The center has partnerships with several local businesses. I think your experience would be perfect for some of the openings we have right now." As Ms. Rivera and Destiny's mother discussed employment possibilities, Officer Chen noticed Destiny sitting quietly on one of the beds, running her hand over the clean blanket as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "You know what amazes me?" he said softly. "Through everything you've been through, you kept going to school, kept doing your homework, kept trying your best. That shows incredible strength of character." Destiny looked up at him, her eyes tired but more peaceful than he'd seen them all night. "Mom always says education is our way forward," she said. "I didn't want to let her down." "You could never let me down," her mother said, overhearing the conversation. She came to sit on Destiny's other side, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "You've made me proud every single day, even when I didn't know the full story of how strong you were being." The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow through the room's small window. Officer Chen stood up, knowing his shift was long over, but feeling more energized than exhausted. "I should get going," he said, "but I'll check in on you both later today. And I have some other calls to make." "Other calls?" Destiny asked curiously. Officer Chen smiled. "Let's just say I know some people who might want to help. This community takes care of its own." He didn't mention his plans to talk to his fellow officers, or the school principal, or the local business association. There would be time for that later. As he headed for the door, Destiny suddenly jumped up and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for helping us." Officer Chen hugged her back carefully, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. "Remember, you don't have to be strong alone anymore. You've got people in your corner now." As he walked back to his car in the early morning light, Officer Chen was already making mental notes of who to call first. He knew that once people heard Destiny's story, once they understood the quiet dignity and determination of this young girl and her mother, they would want to help. This wasn't just about finding them a permanent home or a stable job anymore. It was about showing them that their community cared, that strength didn't always mean handling everything alone, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was accept the help that was offered. "Destiny," he said gently, "you've been incredibly brave and strong. but you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. There are people and organizations that can help both you and your mom get back on your feet, together. She looked at him skeptically. But how? The shelters are all full, and we don't have any money for rent. Trust me, Officer Chen said, his voice firm but kind. I know people who can help. We can start making phone calls right now if you'd like. What you've done, keeping up with school, staying positive, protecting your mom, that shows amazing character. Now it's time to let others help you both get to a better place. For the first time that night, Destiny's careful composure cracked slightly, and Officer Chen saw the frightened, tired child beneath the brave facade. Do you really think things could get better? She asked, her voice small and hopeful. Officer Chen nodded, reaching slowly for his phone. I know they can. And I promise you this, whatever happens next, you and your mom will face it together. No more nights alone in the playground. No more pretending. It's time for both of you to get the help you deserve. As the night grew deeper around them, Officer Chen and Destiny sat on the playground bench, their conversation flowing more easily now that the initial barrier of fear had been broken. The streetlights cast a soft glow around them, making the playground feel like a small island of light in the darkness. Would you like to tell me more about what happened? Officer Chen asked gently, watching as Destiny pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. He noticed how she sat up straighter, gathering her thoughts before speaking, as if preparing to give a presentation in class. It all started about a month ago. Destiny began, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Mom was working 2 jobs, at the grocery store during the day and cleaning offices at night. She never complained, even though I could see how tired she was all the time. She'd still make sure to help me with my homework whenever she could. She paused, fiddling with the zipper of her backpack. Then the grocery store closed down. Just like that. No warning or anything. Mom tried to get more hours at her night job, but they couldn't give them to her. We managed for a while with what she had saved up, but then... Officer Chen noticed how her voice caught slightly. He waited patiently, giving her time to find her words. Sometimes silence could be the kindest response. The landlord gave us 3 days to leave, she continued, her fingers now gripping the edge of the bench. Mom tried everything. She called all these places for help, but everyone was either full or had long waiting lists. The women's shelter was the only place that could take her right away, but they said they didn't have facilities for children. She looked up at Officer Chen, her eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond her years. Mom was crying so hard when she called my friend's mom to ask if I could stay with them for a while. But I never went there. I couldn't. They're struggling too. They barely have enough food for themselves. I didn't want to be another burden. Officer Chen felt his heart squeeze tight in his chest. So you decided to stay here instead? Destiny nodded, gesturing to her carefully organized space under the slide. I picked this playground because it's close to school. I can still get there early every morning to wash up in the bathroom and change clothes. Nobody notices anything different about me. I even volunteer to stay late in the library sometimes, so I can do my homework where it's warm. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a slightly crumpled paper, smoothing it carefully before showing it to Officer Chen. It was a math test with a big A+, marked in red at the top. I got this last week, she said, a hint of pride breaking through her serious expression. Mom always says education is our way to a better life. I don't want to let her down, even if things are hard right now. Officer Chen stared at the test paper, feeling tears well up in his eyes again. The careful calculations and neat handwriting told a story of determination that went far beyond simple mathematics. This was a child who refused to let her circumstances define her future. What does your mom think you're doing right now? He asked softly, handing the test paper back to her. I tell her I'm doing homework with friends after school and then having dinner with them, Destiny explained, carefully tucking the test back into her backpack. I visit her at the shelter every day after school, but I leave before dinner time. I tell her I'm going back to my friend's house, but really, she gestured around the playground. I come here instead. And what about food? Officer Chen asked, noticing how thin she looked. I get free breakfast and lunch at school, Destiny said matter-of-factly. And sometimes, if I help clean up after lunch, the cafeteria ladies give me extra food. They think I'm just being helpful, but really, She shrugged, trying to make light of it, but Officer Chen could see the struggle behind her casual words. You know what the hardest part is? She continued, her voice getting softer. It's not even sleeping out here, or being cold, or hungry sometimes. It's seeing Mom every day and pretending everything's okay. She's trying so hard to find a new job, and I can see how worried she is about me. Yesterday, she gave me her last $5 to buy school supplies, but I saved it instead. I thought, maybe if I save enough, we could get a small apartment again. Officer Chen had to take a deep breath to steady himself. In his 20 years on the force, he'd seen all kinds of situations, but Destiny's quiet courage, her determination to protect her mother while carrying such a heavy burden, struck him deeply. She paused, taking another sip of coffee. I didn't want to tell her the truth. She's trying so hard to find a new job, and I didn't want her to worry about me. I can handle this. I'm strong. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the weight she'd been carrying. Officer Chen felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back quickly. In all his years on the force, he'd seen a lot of difficult situations, but something about Destiny's quiet strength, her determination to protect her mother while carrying such a heavy burden, touched him deeply. You know what, Destiny? You are strong. Stronger than anyone your age should have to be, he said softly. But being strong doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is accept help when we need it. He watched as she processed his words, her hands still wrapped around the now empty coffee cup. The night had grown colder, and he could see her suppressing another shiver. The thin blanket she had clearly wasn't enough protection against the autumn chill. I'm afraid, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. If people find out, they might separate us, Mom and me. We're all each other has. I can't lose her too. The fear in her voice was raw, real, and it hit Officer Chen like a physical blow. He leaned forward slightly, making sure to catch her eye. Destiny, I promise you this, whatever happens next, I won't let anyone separate you from your mom. We're going to figure this out together, okay? There are people and places that can help both of you, and I'll make sure you stay together. For the first time that night, he saw something shift in Destiny's expression, a tiny flicker of hope breaking through the careful mask of independence she'd been wearing. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she could trust his words. Can we really get help? She asked, and for just a moment, she sounded like the child she was supposed to be, not the adult she'd been forced to become. Without making things worse. Officer Chen nodded, feeling his own tears finally spill over. He didn't try to hide them this time. Sometimes, he knew, it was important to let others see that their pain touched you, that their struggles mattered. Officer Chen took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts as he stood near the playground slide. The metal structure loomed above him, its familiar shape transformed by the nighttime shadows. He could clearly see now what he only glimpsed from his patrol car. There was definitely someone huddled beneath the play structure, trying their best to remain invisible to the world. Hello there, he called out softly, keeping his voice gentle and warm. I'm Officer Chen. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay. He stayed where he was, giving whoever was hiding their space. Sometimes, he knew, the best way to help someone was to let them come to you. For a moment, nothing happened. The night remained still, broken only by the distant sound of a car passing on the main road. Then, slowly, a small figure emerged from the shadows. Officer Chen's heart clenched in his chest as he saw her, a young girl, probably no more than 12 years old, clutching a thin blanket around her shoulders. Her school backpack sat beside her, worn but neat, and her clothes, though clearly slept in, showed signs of careful maintenance. I'm not doing anything wrong, the girl said quietly, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. I'm just resting here. Her eyes met Officer Chen's, and he was struck by the mix of fear and determination he saw there. This wasn't a child causing trouble, this was a child trying to survive. Officer Chen nodded slowly, keeping his movements calm and predictable. He noticed how she had positioned herself, close enough to the street to hear if anyone approached, but hidden enough to stay out of sight. Smart, he thought. Too smart for someone so young to have to be. Would you like some warm coffee? He offered, holding up his thermos. It's getting pretty cold out here. He saw her hesitate, weighing her options, before she gave a small nod. As he unscrewed the cap and poured some coffee into it, he noticed how she tracked his every movement, ready to run if needed. "My name's Destiny," she said finally, accepting the warm cup with both hands. "I know I probably shouldn't be here, but," she trailed off, taking a small sip of the coffee. Her eyes widened slightly at the sweetness. Officer Chen's wife always made sure to add extra sugar, knowing her husband's sweet tooth. "How long have you been sleeping here, Destiny?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, free of judgment. He watched as she wrapped her fingers tighter around the warm cup, seeking comfort in its heat. 2 weeks, she admitted after a moment, "but I'm doing okay, really. I go to school every day, and I keep up with my homework. See?" She gestured to her backpack, and Officer Chen noticed several textbooks peeking out. "I use the lights from the park to study when it's dark." The pride in her voice when she talked about school made Officer Chen's throat tight with emotion. He was a child, sleeping in a playground, and still making sure to do her homework. He thought about his own daughter at home, probably complaining about having to finish her math problems before bed. "Can you tell me about your family, Destiny?" he asked carefully, settling down on a nearby bench. He made sure to leave plenty of space, letting her know she could join him if she wanted to. "Is there someone we can call?" Destiny's face clouded over slightly, but she straightened her shoulders, maintaining that remarkable dignity that had struck Officer Chen from the start. "My mom. She's at the women's shelter downtown. They couldn't take kids, and she needed a safe place to stay after we lost our apartment. She thinks I'm staying with my friend from school, but..." Just as he was about to speak, to announce his presence gently, a small sound caught his attention. It was barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet of the night, it rang out clear as a bell, the sound of someone trying to suppress a shiver. That single sound told Officer Chen everything he needed to know about how to proceed. This wasn't going to be about enforcement or authority. This was going to be about help, about understanding, and about making sure whoever was hiding in those shadows knew they weren't alone. The crisp autumn air carried a subtle warning of the winter to come as Officer James Chen guided his patrol car through the quiet streets of Riverside Park. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty playground, their gentle glow barely reaching the corners where darkness gathered. It was just another routine patrol, or at least that's what it seemed like at first. For the third night in a row, something caught his attention. There it was again. A quick movement, almost like a shadow dancing away from his headlights. Someone or something was definitely trying to stay hidden. Most officers might have brushed it off as a stray cat, or maybe just their imagination playing tricks after a long shift, but Officer Chen had always trusted his instincts. 20 years on the force had taught him that sometimes the smallest details could lead to the biggest discoveries. He slowed his car to a crawl, his experienced eyes scanning the playground equipment. The swing sets swayed slightly in the evening breeze, chains creaking a lonely melody. The slide, once bright and cheerful during daylight hours, now stood like a silent sentinel in the park. But there was something different about its shape tonight, something that didn't quite match the familiar outline he'd grown used to seeing. Officer Chen remembered his own childhood, how this very park used to be filled with laughter and the sounds of playing children. Now, at this hour, it should have been completely empty, yet his gut told him otherwise. He'd noticed the pattern developing over the past few days, that subtle movement, always around the same time, always in the same area near the slide. The first night, he dismissed it. The second night had made him curious. But now, on the third night, he couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just professional curiosity driving him, it was genuine concern. In all his years of patrolling this beat, he'd learned that unusual patterns often meant someone needed help, even if they didn't know how to ask for it. Pulling his car to a gentle stop, Officer Chen switched off the headlights but left his parking lights on. He didn't want to startle whoever was out there, but he also needed to investigate. The safety of his community wasn't just a job to him, it was a calling. Every person, every shadow, every unexplained movement could be someone who needed help. He reached for his flashlight but hesitated. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the direct approach wasn't always the best one. Instead, he decided to take a different route. He grabbed the warm coffee thermos from his cup holder. His wife had insisted he take it with him tonight, saying the weather was getting too cold for his usual patrol routine. Now, somehow, that thermos felt like it might come in handy. As he stepped out of his car, The crunch of fallen leaves under his boots seemed unusually loud in the quiet park. He made sure his movements were slow and deliberate, not wanting to frighten away whoever was hiding. The playground equipment cast strange shadows in the dim light, creating a maze of dark and light patches across the ground. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of traffic from the highway and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. But underneath these familiar nighttime noises, Officer Chen's trained ear picked up something else, something that made his heart skip a beat. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet. He approached the slide carefully, his footsteps measured and calm. He wasn't sure exactly what he would find, but something told him this wasn't going to be the usual case of teenagers causing mischief or someone taking a shortcut through the park. This felt different. The way the movement had been so consistent, so careful over the past few nights, suggested someone who was trying to establish a routine, someone who might be using this playground for more than just play. As he drew closer to the slide, the shadows seemed to shift slightly. He could now make out what appeared to be a small figure trying to make itself even smaller, pressed against the base of the slide structure. Officer Chen's heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from concern. Who could be out here at this hour, trying so hard not to be seen? The night air had grown colder, and he could see his breath forming small clouds in front of him. He thought about all the warm homes surrounding the park, all the families tucked safely inside, and wondered about the story he was about to uncover. Something told him this night was going to be different from any other patrol he'd experienced in his 2 decades of service.